Ah yes, Warhammer 40,000, everyone's favorite science fiction setting. But what if it wasn't? There's a general consensus among a lot of sci-fi and literature fans that Warhammer fans are a little arrogant about our property, insisting that, oh, it's totally different, it's not like the other things, it's totally better, and I'm not gonna sit here and say, oh, that's a good thing, it's totally true, suck at everybody else. But I will say that it is kind of true that 40K is different. If you compare 40K to other sci-fi settings, it just always feels so different, and the reason is, 40K isn't sci-fi. And it never has been. Now, bear with me, that might take a little explaining because you think, hey, I mean, it's in the future, and it has scientific technology, and it is fiction in the future, with soldiers and spaceships and all that. How could it be anything other than sci-fi? But let me explain. Those are some of the elements of a setting, like in this case, a space opera, and 40K is undeniably a space opera. It lacks a lot of those key themes, elements, and traits that are prevalent in other science fiction, namely franchises like Star Trek, Dune, a lot of works by people like Arthur C. Clarke, and even Star Wars. Star Wars Legends, of course, not the new Star Wars, because the new Star Wars is basically just an end-to-end story about what is essentially a military conflict. Star Wars Legends, on the other hand, is very expansive and has a lot going on that does drag it more into the realm of science fiction, akin to something like Dune. I actually would really like to make a few videos about some of the stuff from Star Wars Legends that I personally find really interesting, if you guys would be okay with that. And what are these narrative elements of science fiction that make it such, which 40K tends to eschew? Namely, they're themes that reflect back on humanity in a different light, but are still relevant to certain themes. Things like the nature of humanity, what is freedom, what is real. Think of things like The Matrix, or meeting alien civilizations and wondering, can they really be equated to humanity? Or philosophizing on the nature of humanity and what human beings really want or need. This is why a lot of really good and beloved sci-fi series like Dune, again, are often very psychedelic in nature, because even some of their most wild and fantastical elements are still meant to sort of be very cerebral and sort of make you think. How would you react in this situation? What do you take away from this? Where do you go with this from an ideological perspective? 40K doesn't really do that. 40K is a very set narrative where things are laid out in front of you. Yes, we can debate until the cows come home between, oh, is chaos truly evil? Is the Imperium good or bad? Are the Tau justified? This and that. But ultimately, it is a one-to-one story. And while there is a level of exploration involved in a lot of 40K stories and going to new places, it isn't the same kind of space exploration you see in most traditional sci-fi. You know, you're not exploring reaches unknown for the betterment of humanity. You're usually going somewhere dangerous to fulfill some dangerous mission, and you likely know what's going to be there. Something evil. You're not going out there to seek new knowledge for the betterment of your species. You're going there to fight something and kill something. Ultimately, it's been said that a big portion of sci-fi is asking, what if? What if humanity was divided this way? What if society was like this? What if spice melange existed? What if the Force existed? What if we were a part of a galactic federation and had to explore and have our very human ideals and ways of being challenged? What if this? What if that? What if you could visit the future? What if you could visit the past? What if you could visit an alternate dimension? 40K never asks what if. 40K tells a very clear story revolving around a set of events that has a very clear timeline and doesn't really mess around with things like time travel. What it's driven by are the interactions between characters and the battles themselves. Usually, the battles and fights are very secondary in sci-fi, while the characters are often used as conduits for the author to express certain ideas, opinions, belief structures, and things like that. When you rule out sci-fi, despite the very clear science fiction-inspired elements, you think, well then what is 40K? Well, you might think, oh, it's military fiction, akin to Starship Troopers or Battletech. But you see, even that's not the case, because a lot of those are still grounded in a sort of reality. They seem almost like if our timeline just progressed down the natural order, divisions in society, the progression of technology towards things like mech fighting, or having to fight the bugs or what have you. Thing is, 40K fighting is completely unrealistic. They're casting magic spells, and yeah, before you get on my case saying it's Psychers and the Warp, It's basically magic, let's be honest here. And they're using swords as principal tools, and a lot of the older bolters were never really used at range. Oftentimes they were fighting with them as though they were shotguns, at damn near point-blank range. Aside from a few hints here and there, it was not at all conducive to proper military strategy, and therefore doesn't really fit the mold of military fiction in the way things like Battletech or Starship Troopers do. So, if it's not science fiction, and it's not military fiction, then what is 40K? Well, 40K, owing to the roots of the Warhammer franchise, is actually, despite being a space opera, dark fantasy. Now, as many of you know, the original property that GW released under the Warhammer brand was Warhammer Fantasy Battles, an absolutely awesome dark fantasy setting with all those common elements that we now view as very generic and very commonplace, and dare I say it, almost a little bit cliche. Orcs, elves, dark elves, cursed artifacts, kingdoms in ruin, a gloomy, grim atmosphere, cursed parts of the world, things like that. And those elements we see translated into 40K very nicely in ways that proper sci-fi settings never really have or can capture. It's part of what makes 40K so unique, so special, and so enduring. Let's take a look at a lot of the key factors of dark fantasy that make it what it is, aside from just generally being quote-unquote dark, and you'll see how well these apply to 40K, better than anything in the sci-fi genre does, aside from the fact that it just is in the future. TVTropes.org, a really good resource for looking into this sort of thing, does divide the categories and themes of dark fantasy into a few different blocks. The first one being magic, and in dark fantasy, magic is near unilaterally evil in nature, and the good people who use magic can often only do so through an intense strength of will, purity of spirit, or learnedness of mind. You know, like Eldar, Skolum Psychers, or Space Marine Librarians. Furthermore, magic weapons are often very prevalent in dark fantasy. You know, the classic cursed sword, cursed amulet, that sort of thing. And as we all know, cursed swords that eat away at your soul are a dime a dozen in 40K at this point. Hell, even a couple good guys have them. Another big element of dark fantasy that differentiates it from sci-fi, aside from the obvious, is the way religion is viewed and portrayed. Oftentimes in sci-fi, religion will be looked at and mentioned, but as a way to compare it to the mentalities humanity might develop in the future in regards to such things, often depicting it as deeply anachronistic and an element of some sort of alien civilization that's holding them back. Or used to make us think, how can we still really believe in gods when we ourselves have almost godlike ability due to our progress? And that is very interesting. But in dark fantasy, religion often takes a much larger part of world building as opposed to being a direct plot point. Namely, most religions will be large, state-run operations that are used to sort of control the populace and steer them in a specific direction via means of morality or a monopoly on salvation. Let me read a little passage here from TV Tropes. In the words of a YouTuber who is better than me, to quote, "Expect Spanish Inquisition ripoffs run by Knights Templar, complete with a grimdark Catholic Gothic theme, but turned up to 11 as a full-blown totalitarian state security matter. While there do tend to be cults, often of eldritch abominations, paganic scary immoral religions, or even more radical offshoots of the big ones, they are often led by a, quote, sinister minister." End quote. Does this sound familiar to anybody? It probably should. It's basically just the ecclesiarchy and the imperial cult. Furthermore, gods are real in dark fantasy and 40K as opposed to sci-fi. And further than that, gods are assholes. In most sci-fi settings, all gods are either completely uncaring about the struggles of mortals, or are actively malicious and feeding off of people's suffering or the worship of dark cults in order to spread their corrupting influence and power. Again, this should sound familiar. This sort of religious superstition, in fact, even goes on to apply to science and technology itself, the thing that's supposed to be what separates science fiction from fantasy. In the book Death of Integrity, we see a group of Space Marines and a Tech Magos come into contact with the AI of a ship from the Dark Age of technology. This ship has been thrown through time and is now stuck in the 41st millennium and disgusted with what it sees humanity has become. It literally calls out the Magos, telling him, "You are nothing more than a mumbling witch doctor throwing around scented oils and burning incense." And yeah, he is undeniably correct. This machine is an example of something from a proper sci-fi setting being thrust into the dark fantasy that is 40K. It's just so mind-bogglingly different. When quote-unquote forbidden technology is dealt with in science fiction, it's in the regards of how far can we push technology before we start to lose our humanity, or how long until AI starts to overtake humans in terms of what truly is in charge. The idea of technology being limited is not something new, but it never takes this form: tech heresy. The idea of anything being called heresy really is just completely incompatible with science fiction in general. And look at the language used in 40K. Heresy, burn the witch, mutant, suffer not to live. These are all very dark fantasy, archaic terms and mentalities. And we as a fandom sort of take it for granted and have just sort of internalized it all without really processing what it truly means in a narrative context. The only way I could see something like tech heresy making its way into a proper sci-fi setting would be something like Stargate, where if they gated onto a planet that was living amongst the ruins of a greater civilization and only had a base passed down knowledge on how to maintain things. And even in that case, tech heresy would be seen as a really alien backward concept that probably endangers the heroes and needs to be pushed back against and stamped out, as opposed to 40K, when it's generally speaking a decently correct mentality to have in regards to staying alive and keeping the Imperium functioning. And that's another element of why 40K is dark fantasy. All these backwards superstitious things are absolutely true. Elements like demonology, or spirituality manifesting miracles, or the machine spirits. Like, the AI aboard that ship criticized the Tech Magos as being a witch doctor, but the Magos is absolutely right. Machines will operate independently of themselves if the machine spirit is properly motivated or angry. Machines will completely refuse to cooperate or function if they haven't been appeased in some way. We know this to be canon fact. And funnily enough, this is actually something that is kind of based in reality in a way. For those who don't know, there is an area of theoretical science called long-term nuclear waste storage and containment. What this is about is theorizing hypotheticals as to how humans can reliably and safely store long-term radioactive waste, because those last and are still dangerous for thousands and thousands of years, probably long after our current system of symbols and languages have eroded, especially if there's some, like, I don't know, cataclysmic global event. And one theory posits that you can use religion as a way to make sure people stay away from these nuclear sites, because some of the oldest, longest-lasting things that we know of and have are religion and religious symbols. So if you created a hypothetical religion, like a quote-unquote nuclear priesthood centered around warning people and keeping people away from these symbols that signal nuclear radiation, it would likely survive. In a way, you really can see that in regard to the Mechanicus, because I don't think many of the Mechanicus know why exactly AI is banned so ferociously, but they just know that it is, and most of them are very ardent in making sure it stays that way. They don't know about the cybernetic revolt, but the consequences of it, codified in their religion, still lasts. And this goes into another element of dark fantasy. It sort of shines a light back on elements of humanity, but not in the same way sci-fi does. It shines it on the worst personable aspects of us. Fear, hatred, prejudice, violence, the inability to cooperate in even the most dire of circumstances where we think, oh, we absolutely would be able to put aside our differences. Hell, even the abominations that people fight against are reflections of humanity itself. The Chaos Gods are born from human emotion and failing. And this is nothing new to sci-fi, like Halo has the Gravemind saying, I'm a monument to all your sins, but 40K has that a step further, where it's in a much more mystical and even literal sense. That's the sort of thing you see in dark fantasy, where the Eldritch Abominations, as opposed to being these outsider entities, are not really these unknowable things from beyond, but are part of us. They're comprehensible, and that's where the true horror comes from. It's the understandable darkness within ourselves that makes this setting so bleak, as opposed to outside factors. Furthermore, the characters in sci-fi will often be very heroic, or very scientific in nature, very rational, and will generally embody various traits and ideals that we in our current present society view as desirable or conducive with the development of the species as a whole. In dark fantasy, on the other hand, characters will often be a lot more complex, will have various things that they're planning or wanting to do, or will generally just have to be jaded in order to deal with all the horrible things around them and do what needs to be done in order to save as many people as they can, regardless of how it makes them look. Kind of like how many Space Marines, Inquisitors, and other kinds of characters are so gritty and grim about everything going on around them. It's because they're dark fantasy heroes, not sci-fi explorers. Furthermore, politics will often be a lot less nuanced in dark fantasy as opposed to sci-fi, where in sci-fi, you can have reflections of real governments and things that seem they could be based in reality as to, again, make us think. While in dark fantasy, it's often very one-note and very, very overly grim. Hence why people defending the Imperium or liking the Imperium isn't necessarily a bad thing, because again, it's not grounded in anything resembling reality. It's not like the Helghast from Killzone. It's more akin to something like Tsarist Russia, where there's a very small clique of people who squabble amongst themselves but ultimately are united, and the peasantry is very not well cared for, and religion is this overarching thing with a very powerful priesthood. Moreover, in dark fantasy settings, there is often an evil, oppressive, borderline genocidal empire, which still ends up being the quote-unquote good option when compared to everything else. And this everything else usually being the Horde, which comes from the edges of the map and does a lot of burning and pillaging and things like that, which is often worse than you would expect. This despite the fact that the alternative in the Empire is often hive slum cities. Again, that should sound very familiar to us involved in 40k. And not to mention the inclusion of various fantasy races in 40k that are never really present in much sci-fi settings, such as high elves, wood elves, dark elves, orcs, dwarves, and some kind of all-consuming evil race which is a representation of plague, in this case the Tyranids. And the more you look into it, the more it comes up. Like, the random civilians in 40k don't come across like average people you see in sci-fi settings, they come across like medieval serfs, with a few set of people among them who are capable of withstanding the horrors and are scooped up and whisked away, as opposed to enrolled in some glorious starfaring academy. It just works on so many levels, and I think it's really hard to deny it. This is why, unfortunately in my mind, more recent stuff in 40k, namely the era Indominus, often feels really hollow and kind of like it doesn't fit. It's because those narratives are starting to drift more towards sci-fi adventure and mil-spec, but still holding on to the base values and themes put forward from the dark fantasy heritage of 40k. For example, replace Space Marine with Paladin, and suddenly the inclusion of things like Primaris and the technological advancements of recent just don't really fit. Oh, you're an ancient monastic order of paladins that take inspiration from an ancient hero, and now here's new paladins who are bigger and have better armor and better weapons. It just feels weird. And that's not to mention the inclusion of literal nuns in the setting. It's also why, and I'm glad I'm only kicking this wasp nest at the very end of the video, the idea of female Space Marines just kinda seems odd, or doesn't seem to fit. In a proper mil-spec or sci-fi setting, it makes absolute sense, and it would be a no-brainer. Hell, look at Battletech, they have the elementals, and people love those. But in regards to 40k, you're essentially asking a fantasy monastic paladin order to, hey, start including women in your ranks. It just feels anachronistic. It just doesn't sit right in regard to what Space Marines are deep down. That being the long arm of the oppressive empire and a part of the problem as to why humanity and life in general sucks in this setting, but something that's ultimately necessary in the face of the truly awful alternative, creating something truly dark and hopeless. And not to say I would ever be upset if they introduced female Space Marines, I'd be fine with it. I'm just saying there's a reasoning there. And I think it's emblematic of the way 40k is going in general. I would never start a hashtag or protest or anything, I'm always gonna love 40k, but it does make me consider maybe I should get into the old world when that comes out, because I feel like it would be up my alley. But again, steering away from that landmine, think of the new 40k stuff, namely everything after The Gathering Storm, and contrast it with some of the older stuff like Dead Sun Black Sky, or The Killing Grounds, or the Iron Warriors Omnibus. A lot of the newer stories probably wouldn't fit if you translated them into a fantasy setting, but some of the older stuff often would, with more noble knights and evil knights, traveling to these really dark places, and having to make deals with elves that you can never truly trust, things like that. Hell, if you even look into not just dark fantasy, but older mythology, and try and translate it into 40k, it does work. Things like Beowulf, or Cuchulainn, or even the Arthurian legends, because dark fantasy draws a lot from those. Seriously, take a crack at it in the comments, I'd love to hear your guys' interpretations. But those sort of things can't really be done to the same effect with something like BattleTech or Star Wars or Star Trek. Though it would be fun to see people try. And all this even considering the fact that Star Wars has its own order of, like, celibate monks. It's not just what the characters are, it's the ideas and themes that are present in the storytelling which truly make it what it is. But maybe you don't agree with me. Maybe you believe that 40k is full-on sci-fi or military fiction, and you like it that way. Because in the comments of my Primaris video, which did really well by the way, thank you so much for the support, a lot of people actually really liked Primaris and the way that 40k is going in general. They found it more in line with their interests, and that's totally fair. I would never fault anyone for that. It's just not what I'm really into as much. I'd love to hear what you guys think in the comments below. Do you think 40k should stay dark fantasy, or do you think this new direction is cool? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.